Okay, great.
Because it's way.
How much time do you want each panelist to
I
have?
want them to
Welcome back, everyone. So we are moving up the scale. If I were in the movie business, I would talk about pulling back the lens, right? And we're now going to move up to the level of the whole country. Because in addition to Charles's very deep and specific influences and connections to particular regions, like the Pacific Northwest and the Colorado Plateau, we all know, of course, that his work has had and will continue to have a national influence. And my colleague and good friend, Professor Kristen Carpenter, is going to moderate this panel. Kristen is herself an expert, nationally recognized figure in American Indian law, and also property law, cultural property, international rights of indigenous peoples, and a lovely and amazing and very unassuming and stylish, I should add, person. And so I'm very happy to turn the podium over to Kristen to moderate this wonderful panel. I hope you have your tissues out, because now you know you need them for the rest of this conference. So thank you, Kristen.
Thank you, Sarah. That was very kind. I don't know if she's killing time because Charles isn't in here, but Sarah also is very stylish, as well as a very kind and generous colleague. And Sarah, really, to talk about being unassuming, has done such incredible work to pull this event together with respect to the vision, the invitations, all of the logistics and so on, of course, with Britt Banks and Sean LeBar and William and me sort of tagging along. But thank you, Sarah, for doing this and for including all of us. I and
Charles is just going to the bathroom.
okie dokie, artichoke. This is great, actually, because I have these long passages of Charles that I was going to read, and now I can because he's not here. I'm going to save my personal reflections and the teary part of my remarks for later, for the panel at the end of the day. On this panel that has, I think, by its title, evokes the West, of course, as well as Wallace Stegner. There were two themes in Charles's work that I wanted to bring out. And one is the way in which, and I assume many people have this experience, but often when I'm faced with a research problem or challenge, I just go to the Charles Wilkinson shelf on my bookshelf, and there's a whole shelf of Charles Wilkinson books. The two that I pulled off in preparation for this panel are Crossing the Next Meridian and The Eagle Bird, which are both focused with this large region west of the 100th meridian. And the two themes that I wanted to draw attention to are the ways in which I think that Charles, originally as an Easterner, came to the West and was just so struck by its beauty, its difference, its austereness, I think, as other people have said, and perhaps was able to see the West with fresh eyes that some of its longtime residents and intergenerational conflicts didn't have in terms of perspective. And so he writes in Crossing the Next Meridian really beautifully about how he first, and as he often does, he situates it in his own personal story, but he first came to Arizona to work at a law firm in 1965. He starts right with a description of the place, and I'll just read one sentence here since we do have a few minutes of time. So he says, "My first deep contact with the American West was in Arizona in 1965, a time and place when you could see historical eras laid out in front of your eyes, almost like a highway cut through the hillside, exposing the geological layers of soil and rock. You could see an occasional rider on horseback in downtown Phoenix, loping near the aluminum and glass towers that were fast on their way up." He goes on to describe, right, this place where he came to work, and describes with increasing, I think, pain, really, emotion, about how the laws and policies that were governing that place were hurting the lands and the resources and the people who lived there. And he coins this phrase, the lords of yesterday, to talk about those laws and policies that were hurting the people. He offers a prescription at the end when he says, "Crossing the next meridian, then, requires more than abolishing the lords of yesterday, the various policies and laws governing hard rock mining in the public range. It will require abolishing the philosophical ideas that fueled them, replacing those ideas with new ones. They include sustainability, which in turn implicates the level of population. The crossing will also require Westerners to accept personal responsibility for the impacts on the lands, waters, and communities in a way that has not occurred before." Charles, I'm taking a few extra minutes to read some passages of your writing that inspired this panel. And we're starting with Crossing the Next Meridian. And at the end of this book, I think he issues a call to action that we've heard echo through this entire day and a half so far. So after describing that crossing the meridian next meridian requires something new, a new way of thinking about the law, the policy, the rules, he says, "I do believe we must act now at this meridian, or we will be too late. Not too late, perhaps, to preserve a West that mostly passes a car window test, but too late to preserve as living places the vast and sacred habitats that the dying off animals speak for. It would be painful, even immoral, to pass by the opportunity to act now, because it should not be so hard to mesh the needs of the lands and the waters and the people. They ought to be the same. In the last analysis, they are the same." And I think this panel, through its esteemed group of speakers, will probably evoke the ways in which Charles, again, as somebody who came to the West with fresh eyes, new ideas, passion, and morality, has been able to inspire reform and change, and is going to continue to do so over the next years of his career. And Charles, I said I would save my personal reflections for the end of the day when we have our panel. And I do want to acknowledge Anne and your family here. I think it's probably in some ways interesting to be at a professional conference celebrating all these accomplishments, and your family, of course, are the ones that have lived through it all day by day. So thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. So to introduce the panel, and of course, we're sort of going in order. This is an incredibly esteemed group of longtime Westerners, scholars, lawyers, and activists. Tom Fredericks, to my left, is a partner at Fredericks, Peebles & Morgan firm that he founded. Tom was formerly the executive director of the Native American Rights Fund. He also served in Indian Affairs in the Carter administration. He's one of our first American Indian law graduates of the law school, and we've always been incredibly proud of him. He also gave me my very first Indian law job when I was, I can't even remember, 23 or something, so thank you, Tom. To his left is Bob Kiter, a professor of law at the University of Utah. Appropriately, he's the Wallace Stegner Professor of Law and the founding director of the Wallace Stegner Center for Land, Resources, and the Environment. To his left is Scott Miller, who's the Senior Regional Director for the Southwest region of the Wilderness Society. Scott has previously worked here with us at the law school in the Getches Wilkinson Center, and will be sharing his reflections with us. And Don Snow is a professor of environmental studies at Whitman College. He was previously the director of the Northern Lights Research Institute in Missoula, and I think will share some of those perspectives with us as well. We'll go just in order of the seating arrangement here, and each panelist will take about 15 minutes to share their thoughts, and we should have some time for a Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I think it's a very appropriate thing to do, is to honor my friend Charles. I've worked with him since 1971. When I first met him, I thought he was a slave driver because I was a law student, third-year law student, and I was his law clerk. And I had come to law school. I want to give you a little bit of history because Charles always says you got to know the history. I was working in the poverty program of the Johnson and Kennedy era. We had just come out of the Eisenhower termination era policy for Indians, and we were coming out of a pretty dark time. But Johnson had put together the poverty program, so I was the community action program director at a reservation in North and South Dakota. And we were able to show the United States government through this poverty program that we could contract, that we could run contracts, that we could hire people, we could be responsible for ourselves. But there was always an effort on my part. My job was to try to bring us out of poverty, so I'd work on things like creating an airport authority, or working with the schools to try to get better education. And I'd put together a program, and the damn Washington lawyer would come out and kill it in 5 minutes. And it kept happening. I'd work on something for 30, 40, 45 days, and the claims lawyer from DC would come out and kill it. So finally I saw in the paper that they had an Indian law program in New Mexico that would fund Indians in law. And so I decided to go to law school. If a lawyer had that much power, I wanted to be a lawyer. And so I happened to talk with Brian Deloria, and he was here in law school. And so he said, come to Colorado. So he and I worked it out, and I became I came to Colorado. And I was a third-year law student maybe a second-year law student when I started lobbying David Getches to come to Colorado. NARF was going to be created. It was with the CILS, California Indian Legal Services, and they wanted to break it away. And I thought that Colorado would be more have its own identity. NARF would have its own identity. It wouldn't be part of the Pacific Northwest. It wouldn't be part of the Southwest, Southeast, Northeast. And so that was my argument. Plus, I worked with the faculty here and tried to get them to help by giving them some relationship with the law school. And that was the start. As a second-year law student, we created an Indian law program, her first law course. And Court Peterson, who was a pretty crusty guy that was pretty conservative, he decided he would teach Indian law for us. So I got him he and I went with David, and I think Reed Chambers and Monroe Price, and got their material, and we taught that law course together. I was a student in it, but I also helped him a lot in teaching that course, and that was the start of Indian law at CU. But anyways, when I got to know Charles, I was a law clerk at NARF, and of course, he grabbed me right away and said, "We got this brief we got to write." It was a Bakke case. It was affirmative action. And so I said, "Well, what could I say?" He was my boss. And so I said, "Sure." So I thought I'd write a memo and I'd be done with it. Little did I know, he said, "No, you got to write a draft of the brief." And it was right when I was taking finals in my third year. And I remember being up at 4 o'clock cussing Charles because I was working on the brief and trying to study for a final. And we had this guy named Browning Pipestem who worked with Charles at NARF. And he and I were at loggerheads on some of the case law that I didn't think worked, and he thought they did. So Charles had to referee for us. Browning had a pretty big ego, so it was kind of difficult, but we got through it. And so I turned my brief in, and I went home for Christmas. I didn't want to see Colorado again. But I came back, and I thought, well, the brief is done. I don't have to worry about it. And I was sitting in class. Denny Hines had an advanced class in real estate planning, I believe it was. Knock on the door. Here comes Charles. Pretty soon, Denny says to me, "Charles needs you." So we had to go down and proof the galleys on the printer down in Denver someplace. He made me go down there, so I really had an experience. I look back at it, and who else would get the opportunity to write a brief and work so hard on it and get to see all of it? Then to reward me, he put in the brief itself, he thanked me for all the hard work I did. So that was the reward. And then having lobbied for NARF to be here, I kind of wanted to go home. But Charles and David and Bob, all the guys said, "No, we come here because you were here and you're going to be part of us." So I had to stay here, even though they only paid me $12,500 for my first job. I could have made a little more at home, but I did it. And Charles took me under his wing and mentored me, and I've been a better lawyer for that because of that. I remember working on a case that we sued President Nixon on. Bobby Kennedy, as a senator, had worked hard on kind of reviewing Indian education and came up with a bill that created Indian Advisory Council on Indian Affairs. And one of the things that, as young NARF lawyers, and as NARF, we had pretty damn liberal people at NARF in those days. David and Charles got a lot more conservative than they were in those days. And I was kind of conservative. I was a conservative one. But anyways, we were looking at what is our priorities. We had a board, and sovereignty was one of the main, protecting our sovereignty. And one of the things that we were trying to do was empower Indians. The BIA had a boss farmer. You had to brand your cattle if you owned them. You had to put an ID, Interior Indian Department, on them so you couldn't sell them without their approval. So BIA controlled everything. So we were trying to empower Indians to run their own affairs. So we had created the Coalition of Indian-Controlled School Boards. We created some intertribal groups. We created the IHEC. I don't know what that stands for, but it was the colleges, Indian colleges. And we worked with NCAI. And there was another program that Nixon had put together where Spiro Agnew was the chairman of that. I don't remember the name of it, but we worked with them. There was always a rift between NCAI and that group. We created the National Tribal Chairmen's Association. We helped them get going. So that was our whole effort, was empowerment. And so when the Nixon refused to appoint the National Indian Education Advisory Council, the Coalition of Indian-Controlled School Boards came to us and said, you got to sue them. So Charles was one of the lead lawyers, and so he said, we're going to sue President Nixon and force him to appoint that school board, that advisory council. So I helped. I was a minor player, I thought. And so we all went to Washington on a hearing, and when we got there, the chairman of the Coalition of School Boards said, damn, you guys are all about Indians being empowered. We want an Indian to argue it. Well, I was the only Indian there at the time, so I had to argue it. And I'd have never made it through that argument, but for Charles, he helped me through it. And of course, everybody thought, well, we're going to get dismissed because we sued the president. And so these guys were all betting how long it would take before the United States moved to dismiss. Well, they took about 3 minutes, and then they start passing these $5 bills across the table, getting me worried that the judge was going to get mad. But we won that case, and we did get that advisory council put in place, but we did it because the United States couldn't act. The Department of Justice attorney was told, you come back here with authority to agree to appoint that committee, and he couldn't get the White House to act that fast, so the judge just ordered him to do it, ordered the administration to do it. So that was kind of baptismal by fire in that case. Then I've also worked with Charles on many other cases. I know one time we worked for a school board in, I think it was Washington, on the Colville Reservation, and they had a free lawyer. And that lawyer had advised them to resign and get out of the way. So we were trying to turn that around. We thought it was against our policy of empowerment. And so we would meet with them. And I don't know if Charles is still this way, but when he was first at NARF, he didn't even have a chair in his room. He had a desk that he stood up at, and he had a pipe in his mouth, and he had a dictaphone. And all he would do was dictate. And so when we went to meet with these guys, this board, Well, we'd meet with them at night. We'd take the ferry across the river, and we'd go to whatever town it was in Washington. Then we'd get done, we'd drive like hell to get across the bridge or up north so that we could beat the bar from closing so we get a six-pack to drive back to Spokane. And of course, Charles, he was always dictating. And so I told him, Charles, you keep making me stay up this late and drinking beer. And I said, what they're going to hear when you're driving down, when they pick us out of the bottom of this reservoir, is you're going to hear, God damn it, Tom, you missed that turn. And it was scary because it was tough staying awake. And then, instead of, we'd get in at 2 o'clock in the morning maybe, and we'd catch the 7 o'clock flight back to Denver. I don't know why he did that, but he was the boss, so I just went along with it. But, back more on a serious note, we were looking at Indian affairs, and we were trying to develop policies. And like empowerment was a big policy. But we also start looking at Indian self-determination. It wasn't good enough just to run our affairs. We needed to start developing policies that would have our input and would give us rights. And I should give you a little history on that too. The claims lawyers, which Felix Cohn was one of them, had a lot of say in Indian affairs. The talk in Washington was your Indians and my Indians. So the Bureau would say, can you get your Indians to do this? And they'd say, well, I'll see what my Indians say. And that was the way policy was kind of put through in those days. So that was contrary to what we thought should be the policy. And so we started working it was the Nixon administration then, and we had a person in there, it was Brad Patterson, was a pretty good guy. And we had a lady that was higher up in the chain of command there by the name of Bobby Green Kilberg. And they were working, she bought into our policy of self-determination. So we worked on that with Reed. Reed Chambers was the associate solicitor for Indian Affairs then. So we worked with them and got that policy put in place. And that's how the policy of Indian self-determination got started. But we were very fortunate at NARF to have, although we had some pretty liberal guys, we had some pretty big thinkers. Charles was excellent, as you all heard here today, at thinking things through and coming up with a strategy of how it would work. John Echohawk, myself, and Yvonne Knight kind of kept them grounded that we were still Indians and we needed to work with the Indians and make sure the Indians bought into our efforts. And but Charles would help me immensely on these cases. I always worked under him, and as I worked up the chain at NARF, he was leaving about the time I became the director, I think, and I tried to get him to stay, but there was no keeping him in NARF. He was going to Oregon to become a law professor. But that was my experience with Charles as a lawyer. He was very gracious to me. He helped me a great deal, and I'm forever indebted to him for that. Then, as a practitioner, I have had the benefit of Charles being able to call me up and say, Tom, I got this great lawyer. You need to hire him. So we've had a direct chain into CU to get some of the best lawyers. And it's not that they're just smart. Charles has turned them into kind of a lion in Indian law because of his passion for getting things done, for how he presents the law to them. I talked to 3-4 of them before I came, and they all seem to say that Charles made law school better because he didn't teach it by the Socratic method. He taught it by Charles's method, and that was to give them life experiences. And I happened to talk to our law clerk, and she's ecstatic. She's going to spend spring break going on a 9-day tour up in the Northwest. And she couldn't be happier. She's got her plan all planned out. And so we've been received a lot of benefits from that. We've received a lot of good lawyers, and they've all been good. And I know it's not just Charles. I don't want to, my niece, Carla, and Kristen are all part of that, along with Sarah and Rick. So, but we get good lawyers from here, and we're proud of that, and we're proud of what we do because of that. But also, I want to, in closing, to say that, you know, Charles has memorialized all that we have done in these 45 years that I've known him. He's encapsulated history, the policy, and the trials and tribulations that we had to go through to get Indian self-determination, to get 93-638 contracting authority, to get government-to-government relationships. We've moved tribes a long way, and I'm concerned now that our people are again being run by lawyers. A lot of and it's not the tribal lawyers, it's the government lawyers. They're all scared of the bell. All our policy people are told, don't help them Indians do that because that might cause liability to the United States and we'll have another Bell case. So all our policy people are scared to make decisions that helps us. I just want to give you an example. When I was assistant secretary, we had the Seminole tribe came to us and wanted to take some land into trust. We didn't have regulations then for fee to trust, but all the solicitors, you know, I had been to associate solicitors, they all knew me well, and they were all in there saying, don't take that land in trust. They were going to build a casino on it. So I went in and talked to the secretary, said, what should we do? And so we decided it was the Indians versus the bureaucrats, and let's let the Indians win. And so we took it in trust. Now they have $1 billion grossing casino on that spot, but what's wrong with that? You know? And they've been able to take over, I forget the hotel, Hard Rock. Yeah. So that's the kind of, I think that's, you know, I look at our people today now that are in the administration, and a lot of them should be doing a lot more, I think, because Indians are ready to do a lot more economic development, a lot more legal laws and regulate more. I've been in some tough battles on jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is very difficult because of the Dawes Act and the allotment process. And we have our water rights that we fight over, and we need to have a good solid ground to adjudicate those rights. And we're not getting a lot of help from the United States anymore. And I just want to say in closing that I'd like Charles to revisit the Supreme Court book and write the rest of the story after the Supreme Court in the last 20 years. And with that, I'm going to close. Charles, I thank you for all you've done for me and for Indians in general. And in our tradition, when we honor somebody, we give them a gift. So I'd like Charles to come down and receive a gift from me in the form of a blanket that is an Indian blanket. And I'd like to say in my language, Ma Saki Dads Maragua. That means thank you, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for those moving words and the gift of the blanket. And now we'll hear from Bob Kiter.
Thanks, Kristen. I, like the other speakers, appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I speak as a fellow law professor whose career has been influenced by Charles personally and through his work. I'll start with just a couple of quick anecdotes that he may or may not recall, and then a little more formal part of my presentation. I spent the first 15 years of my law teaching career at the University of Wyoming and was involved principally to begin with in constitutional law, civil rights, running a legal clinic at the law school, that sort of thing. The opportunity presented itself about 5-6 years into my time there to do some work in the public lands arena, which led to a couple early publications. I was thinking this is kind of interesting work. It's a little different than the other stuff that I've been doing. I'm not quite sure where this will go. And then it turned out there was a conference down here, or a meeting. I don't recall precisely the event. What I do recall is that Charles Wilkinson was just arriving at the University of Colorado Law School, and he was the featured speaker, I think, at the lunch program, and mentioned that he was in the midst of unpacking boxes and would just be there for a little while. Anyway, he began to launch into his talk. At the beginning or midway through, he mentioned that there were some other people working in this area that might be that he understood were in the room, and he wanted to acknowledge them and their work. I was one of those acknowledged. It gave me confidence to continue in this area. And I think that's reflective of the sort of small kindnesses that are indicative of the type of individual that he is, the influence that he's had on many of our careers. I think I speak for several law professors in the room. One other quick observation along those lines. Back about, 9 years ago, we celebrated through the Wallace Stegner Center over at the University of Utah the centennial of Wallace Stegner's birth. In the course of that, I ended up team teaching with Stephen Trimble, an honors think tank class, which is an undergraduate class with the top students at the university. We styled the class Wallace Stegner and Western Lands, and the first book that we read for the class was Fire on the Plateau, which tied into what was going to be the class project, which was for these students. And this, I should say, this was a year-long class. We met 3 hours weekly. And the project was to address the question of completing Canyonlands National Park. Many of you may be aware that the boundaries don't quite match up with the topography of the area. And there'd been a couple proposals floating around for a while to do this. So we were eventually headed in that direction. So Fire in the Plateau seemed like the right book to start with. I called Charles up and said, I'm teaching this class. There's 10 students in it. They're just finishing reading your book. Would you come over? And he was there. And it was very meaningful to the students. So let me be a little more formal, if I could. I did prepare a few remarks, and it'll be evident, perhaps, why I did that here. So when asked to address, and I won't quite get Charles's cadence here. You all are familiar with that. You don't have to be my cadence, but anyway. When asked to address those dimensions of Charles' life and work that focus on west of the 100th meridian, I immediately, as I suspect everyone in this room would, drew the Wallace-Stegner connection. As I then pondered what I might say, I kept returning to that connection. I am myself indelibly linked to Stegner, as many of you know. And I've previously linked Charles publicly with Stegner, as I'll explain in a moment. First, though, I need to clarify this emerging picture, these connections. In my own work, I've tried to write like Wallace Stegner, and I still am trying. Charles, too, aspired to write like Wally, and he has succeeded in so many ways. Charles' writing not only colors the page with clear and graceful prose, but peppers it with memorable phrases, words of yesterday, and sets forth powerful and persuasive ideas and ethic of place in the manner of all memorable writers and persuasive lawyers. So, according to Charles, if I'm correctly remembering the story that you shared with me, he first met Wally Stegner after rather timorously sending the famous writer an out-of-the-blue personal letter introducing himself and requesting an audience. Somewhat audacious, perhaps, but in character, I think. A few days later, when Charles was himself, I believe it was in California, but out of town, his wife Anne casually mentioned during an evening phone call that he had received a personal letter from someone named Stegner, who appeared to live in California. So what does it say? Charles immediately inquired and had Anne read the letter to him over the phone. Stegner had graciously invited him to call. The connection was made, and before long they were sharing wine in Stegner's Los Altos Hills home. It was a connection and a relationship that quickly deepened until Stegner's untimely death, and it was a relationship that soon evolved into mutual respect and admiration. Charles' writing clearly displays a deep regard for Wallace Stegner. Describing this dean of Western writers in Fire on the Plateau, Charles used these terms. Wallace Stegner, the historian, novelist, essayist, who wrote more than 30 books about the West, especially advanced my comprehension of the nexus between the law and the West itself. Although he rarely mentioned law explicitly, his writing on the Western character explained all the statutes, the land and water and grabs, which the laws encouraged, trace to the get-rich-quick mentality, the quest for the big rock candy mountain. That impulse usually, though not always, overwhelmed the subtler urge for community that many Westerners also held. Earlier, in Crossing the Next Meridian, a title intentionally linked to Stegner's famous book about John Wesley Powell, Charles observed that, quote, many would count Beyond the 100th Meridian as the greatest book ever written about the West. And then Charles goes on in his own book, Crossing. Wallace Stegner has been able to change the lenses to achieve clarity. He merged his life's experiences with his work and his straightforward, unerring pen. He steeped himself in the literature of the West, its waters, its aridity, and its peculiar institutions. He forced his mind back to the very beginning of the westward expansion. Stegner has always seen through the cries of complexity that have been the last refuge of the vested interests. No engineer or lawyer, just an English professor, a self-taught historian, an exquisite writer, and perhaps most of all, a tough-minded Westerner who knew his region. So it's 1995, 21 years ago, when I had the privilege of publicly announcing the establishment of the Wallace Stegner Center at the University of Utah before the Board of Trustees and a substantial audience. And in doing that, I took the occasion to describe Wallace Stegner in these terms: a preeminent writer, scholar, historian, teacher, mentor, conservationist, Westerner, and just plain engaged citizen. 10 years later, 2005, I had the privilege of introducing Charles Wilkinson as the University of Utah College of Law's William H. Leary Lecturer, which is our law school's most prestigious event for the year. And I took the occasion to publicly draw the connection between Charles and Wallace Stegner. Here's a bit of my introduction. Throughout his professional career, as a writer, a teacher, a commentator, and plain citizen, Charles Wilkinson has consistently inspired us to make the American West a better and more civilized place. In the mold of Wallace Stegner, he may well be today's leading authority on the West as a special place and society with its own diverse cultures and unique temperament. But there's actually much more to the Stegner-Wilkinson connection and that relationship. As I've since learned, once Charles sort of unabashedly thrust himself into Stegner's life, they enjoyed a brief but rich correspondence, one that saw the elder statesman increasingly drawn to the young professor's work. Let me share some of that correspondence from Stegner's side. A letter dated February 26, 1986. As best I can tell from reading the entire letter, this is his response to your introductory query. You'll detect some of Stegner's formalism. Dear Mr. Wilkinson, I'm deeply indebted to you for sending on the copies of your 2 articles, Western Water Law and Transition and The Greatest Good for the Greatest Number, as well as your op-ed piece from the Denver Post. It is probably just as well that you left Colorado for Michigan about the time that was published. Your life might have been in danger. I confess that I read both it and the Western Water Law piece with yells of delight and a sense of having come finally to the source of contemporary, up-to-date information that I have been looking for it so happens that I will be giving the Cook Lectures at the University of Michigan in a few weeks, and I'm going to draw upon your work. And then he goes on and says later in the letter, how can we get together? I'll be here with minor excursions of a few days to a week until about June. Then I'm going to Vermont. Might you want to join us in Greensboro, Vermont? And aside, Justice Rehnquist's in the area too, if you're interested. I hope we can make contact in person. Fast forward then, about 9 or 10 months. Next letter. Dear Charles, I cost myself 2 weeks of self-satisfaction and smugness. And notice the change in that tone here from Mr. Wilkinson to Charles. I cost myself 2 weeks of self-satisfaction and smugness by not getting around to your letter and lecture earlier. But this morning, I finally opened your envelope, and was, quite apart from the purring that your last page aroused, charmed, persuaded, and exhilarated by your lecture. It couldn't have been better said. It couldn't have been better tempered or more conciliatory to all parties of the nagging Western dispute, or more likely to bring the warring parties into some sort of consensus that will not only work but will grow. I congratulate you. I will shamelessly steal from you. He goes on to suggest, I hope, and then he parens, you have to publish it. And he concludes, obviously, you give me a hell of a lot more credit than I deserve, but I will take it happily. Nothing would please me better than to have been even 2% responsible for starting you on your career of making the West work. April 1987, fast forward 5 further months. Dear Charles, many thanks for the Indians volume. Pretty soon you will have every aspect of Western land and water law tidied up and made intelligible, if not credible. We'll jump to October 1987. Dear Charles, last night I sweetened my mouth before sleeping with 100 pages of Wilkinson and came to the end of chapter 5. It's going to be a splendid book, the references to Crossing Next Meridian. You have a gift for clear, unconfusing, sequential exposition, and you've got any quantity of important facts to expose. The focus on the effect that laws have in freezing practice, often corrupt or misguided practice, is very effective. Most of us who don't know any law just work our mouths. You show how the cowboys and miners did it. I learned a lot from these 3 chapters. I will learn from every additional one. And then jump forward further, October 28th, 1991. Dear Charles, Dan Frank sent me bound galleys of the Eagle Bird, and I sweetened my mouth with it last night and lost a couple of hours of sleep. It's a splendid book, clear all the way, orderly all the way, and impassioned whenever the script calls for passion, and informed, oh my, this is the best one-shot summary of the Western past and present, and the best forecast of the Western future that I know. I will be quoting you and maybe stealing from you if I ever get around to writing anything. I will write Dan a more coherent note for publicity purposes, but I want you to know how good I find your book. Somehow you have managed to make a lot of disparate lectures and articles take a systematic and satisfying holistic look at the region. And he concludes the letter then, it's a real pleasure to know people who not only have all the right instincts and responses, but who know something. So let me conclude, and you've been quite patient. To return to my Leary lecture introductory remarks about Charles. But more than books, positions, and awards, and other accomplishments, Charles is a genuinely warm and generous person. He has served both as a mentor and inspiration for his colleagues, students, and friends. I can personally attest that he is quick to respond when called upon, ready to offer advice or assistance for most any situation. His deep love for the West, its diverse peoples, and its stunning landscape is unmistakable. With his knowledge, energy, and passion, he sets a high standard for all of us in the Academy. His vision reaches across this expansive region and its many peoples, helping us not only to understand the past, but also to contemplate a brighter future. To wrap up then, here in Charles' home institution, let me put an even sharper point on it by drawing upon Wallace Stegner's immortal words. Charles, you are truly enabling us here, west of the 100th meridian, to create a society to match our scenery. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And it's been wonderful to hear how Charles, as a writer and really as a literary person, how those perspectives complement his work as a lawyer that Tom shared. And we'll now turn to Scott Miller. Thank you.
So purely by happenstance, I'm going to focus my talk by pulling a thread out of Bob's talk, and that is his honors think tank class, which I'll talk about in a minute. But before I do that, I want to take advantage of the opportunity to pull a thread from Tom's talk, and that is cussing Charles in the middle of the night. And so I couldn't sleep last night, and channeling Charles's beautiful outlook on life, I might say, what a privileged way to spend a wakeful night, because I was thinking about him all night long. And at the same time, while that's true, I would say around 4 o'clock this morning, I was getting very thin on patience with you. So I hope you don't mind. I'm going to show some slides. I apologize to my panelists about that. And I'm going to take us back to the Colorado Plateau. I'd like to start in 1930 when legendary wilderness advocate Bob Marshall wrote, "There's just one hope of repulsing the tyrannical ambition of civilization to conquer every niche on the whole earth. That hope is the organization of spirited people who will fight for the freedom of the wilderness. Just a few more years of hesitation, and the only trace of that wilderness which has exerted such a fundamental influence on molding American character will lie in the musty pages of pioneer books. To avoid this catastrophic demands immediate action." In 1935, Bob Marshall co-founded the Wilderness Society to do just that. He then headed back to the heart of the Colorado Plateau and what he called its sensational red sandstone scenery, where, he said, a block of 9 million acres still remain roadless, the largest wilderness remaining in the United States. In 1936, Marshall published the landmark map of the largest roadless areas in the United States, depicting that 9 million acre tract in southeast Utah, which he called the Colorado River Canyons roadless area. That same year, the Park Service floated a proposal for a 4.8 million acre Escalante National Monument to protect a little over half of Marshall's Colorado River Canyons roadless area. You wouldn't be surprised that it made the Utah delegation a little bit anxious. And almost immediately, the proposal was shrunk to 4.4 million acres. In 1937, Marshall wrote, "The universe of the wilderness all over the United States is vanishing with appalling rapidity. It is melting away like some last snowbank on some south-facing mountainside during a hot afternoon in June. It is disappearing while most of those who care more for it than anything else in the world are trying desperately to rally and save it." The next year, the proposal for Escalante National Monument was reduced to 1.6 million acres. Marshall didn't live to see the effort abandoned entirely the following year. His 9 million acre Colorado River Canyons roadless area was left protected by only Utah's first national monument, Teddy Roosevelt's National Bridges National Monument, that little yellow dot. In 1964, when Charles was a second-year law student at Stanford, Congress passed the Wilderness Act, establishing 9 million acres of wilderness, but not one of those acres in Utah. But with persistence, Canyonlands National Park was permanently protected in 1967 and expanded in 1971. 338,000 acres of the inner core of the Colorado River Canyons roadless area. Glen Canyon National Recreation Area also was established in 1971, protecting 1.3 million acres. In 1984, Congress established the Dark Canyon Wilderness at 46,000 acres. In 1991, wilderness study areas were established, and there was the Pariah Canyon Vermilion Cliffs Wilderness, and the Capitol Reef National Park, and the Box Death Hollow Wilderness. It was enough to make the Utah delegation once again anxious. And in 1995, they introduced the Utah Public Lands Management Act, which could fairly be described as an attempt to drive a stake through the heart of the effort to establish wilderness on the Colorado Plateau. Charles helped lead the effort of national outpouring of outrage. In the Wingate in time, our society still seems to lack the will to care for the canyon country. The Utah congressional delegation refusing to listen to the people, the canyons, or the old artisans, wants to declare some fragments of backcountry wilderness and then throw all the rest open to development. That would be so short-sighted, so contemptuous of time. The old images on the walls were made so long ago, the walls themselves even longer. Time runs out to the future too. Give our children, our grandchildren, and those far down the line from them, the blessing of taking a daughter or a son into the weaving, rosy side canyons of finding their own dream panels and of being instructed by the young persons on how to scramble out. Time, oh time, may we not forsake you now. The legislative effort was repelled, and with the help of Charles, John Leshy, and others, President Clinton proclaimed in September of 1996 1.7 million acres of the Colorado River canyons as the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. Suffice it to say that the monument did not shift the Utah delegation's thinking on wilderness. And they came back repeatedly in the 90s to undercut wilderness on the Colorado Plateau. In 2000, Charles wrote about the explosive growth in the West since the big buildup, lamenting, quote, the shadows of sadness that most Westerners see moving across the landscape we love so. The West is under assault, under construction, up for sale, up for grabs. But even then, Charles believed that despite the relentless growth machine, we can still reclaim the West. Quote, we can now realize that we are in a dynamic time, perhaps in the early stages of still another revolution. Quote, we have moved into an era of action and that we are making some considerable progress toward making a land ethic into a working public policy. That the forces of unsustainable development absolutely will be slowed and in time brought to a halt. A few years ago, Utah Representative Rob Bishop announced a public lands initiative, declaring that, quote, the future of the state depends on a responsible balance of both conservation and development. Quote, for the first time, I am seeing the paradigm shift toward a more reasonable, balanced use of public lands in Utah. There appears to be a growing consensus amongst county and state leaders, conservation groups, industry, non-governmental organizations, and the public, he didn't mention tribes, that Utah is ready to move away from the standard gridlock of the past and toward a sensible resolution. It did indeed sound like a paradigm shift for the Utah delegation. SUA, the Grand Canyon Trust, the Wilderness Society, and others engaged directly with counties for more than 2 years. We arrived at collaborative agreements with stakeholders and the Daggett and Summit County commissions that provided a sensible resolution, including more than 100,000 acres of wilderness, another 50,000 acres of conservation areas, wild and scenic rivers. In Grand, Uinta, and Emery counties, the stakes were much higher and the issues more complicated, but we still found significant common ground and made significant progress. But when Representative Bishop recently released his bill, his draft, we learn that the agreements and common ground in Utah were not the kind of paradigm shift he had in mind. In a recent interview, he said, "The idea of passing a bill so everyone will vote for a bill, so I can pat myself on the back and say I passed a bill, that's meaningless." Instead of a paradigm shift, Bishop now says he's determined to push, quote, a paradigm readjustment. In his new wilderness paradigm readjustment, the federal government would grant a spider web of roads to counties in wilderness. Instead of being grandfathered in wilderness, grazing would be kinged in wilderness. Logging and water development would be welcome, but regulating air pollution would be prohibited. Despite the disappointing outcome, it's worth noting that Bishop's bill would designate more than twice as many acres of quasi-wilderness on the landscape as the delegation's 1995 bill. And if one looks deeper than the draft, it appears that Bishop was right about the paradigm shifting in Utah, even if, as it turns out, not in the way he would like. Consider that his bill is considerably more stingy than the recommendations of at least 3 counties. And consider the context, in that context, the strong and historic movement to establish the Bears Ears National Monument in San Juan County by the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition. In many ways, Marshall was right. His Colorado River Canyons roadless area has, to a significant degree, melted away. Particularly since World War II, some parts of it have been mined, flooded, looted, roaded, driven, and drilled. It's no longer the 9 million acres of, quote, inaccessible to mechanized transportation. It never will be again what it was to Bob Marshall. But as Charles points out, quote, there's more wild desert on the Colorado Plateau than anywhere else. The Colorado River Canyons is still one of the largest undeveloped landscapes in the contiguous United States. Marshall's sensational red sandstone scenery remains, and as Charles says, it is a salve to Western city dwellers that elicits profound and intellectual and emotional responses. As Charles declared in Fire on the Plateau, Congress may not yet have declared this part of Canyonlands as official wilderness, but land can define itself on its own terms. This land is wilderness. It is healthy and magnificent and remote and roadless, and the few people are swallowed up in it. There is no doubt a long way to go to permanently protect the outstanding wilderness of the Colorado Plateau. Let's just say it's still fair to assume the Wilderness Society's membership roles, are not filled with Utah County commissioners. But the paradigm is shifting. The tide is turning, both within and around Utah. Consider our newest wilderness areas were designated just last year to protect another one of the lower 48's largest unprotected roadless areas, the Boulder White Cloud Mountains of Utah. Yes, it took congressional leadership, and we had that in Representative Mike Simpson. But this Congress designated 3 new wilderness areas totaling more than 275,000 acres in Idaho. And shortly before that, it also designated the Hermosa Creek Wilderness in southwestern Colorado and the Pine Forest and Wavoka Wilderness areas in Nevada. Now, finally, I believe time is on the side of protecting and healing the Colorado River Canyons. As Charles said in The Eagle Bird, wilderness represents an implicit appreciation of the value of time, of the fact that forests and streams and soil have taken so long to grow that they can never be replaced. It also speaks to our character as a society. The long tomorrows of our wild lands, then, will be marked by a struggle to keep the wilderness ideal intact. The underpinnings for wilderness must be explicated by those people who can speak best of beauty and solitude and good science and deep time and the fundamental values of a society. Poets, artists, photographers, historians, novelists, philosophers, biologists, geologists, and others like them. Charles, a large measure of all of them is no doubt among the best to speak for wilderness. While both are incomparable, I think Charles is in some ways like Bob Marshall, a pragmatic idealist, or maybe a visionary realist, certainly an inspirer and a tireless and incredibly productive advocate. Charles possesses both an incredible mind and a tremendous heart. It is this impressive and unique combination of these qualities that makes him the adored teacher and mentor that he is. It is his bottomless curiosity combined with his powerful spirit that changes lives through his writing. And it is his keen intellect combined with his intense passion that makes him a great and accomplished lawyer. And he is relentlessly ethical and deeply caring, which makes him an incredible friend to both the people and the land. As Charles once called the Wilderness Act a monument to the human spirit, so he is himself. On behalf of our 109 million acres of wilderness and growing, thank you, Charles, for inspiring us with the spirit of wilderness and the optimism to protect it. On behalf of the Wilderness Society, thank you for your service to our organization. As I did talk to Tom, and as Tom Barron told me, you were to our governing council as a compass is to a backpacker. And from me, Charles, thank you far more than I could ever say, far more than I have time to say today. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, for sharing with us the specific impacts of Charles' work on understanding and preserving wilderness. I also love how we're all starting to sound like Charles the more we talk and evoke his work. I know we are running a little bit over time. Apologies that we started the panel late. I would like now to give the mic to Don Snow. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let me add my thanks to those who have already thanked the organizers for this conference. It's turned out to be a very humbling thing to be part of. I want to talk about one of Charles's contributions to the West, but I also want to touch on some matters of what the West means and what it means to be a Westerner. Since family has come up a number of times, I want to place my remarks a little bit within the context of family. So if you can bear with me a little for a moment. This is a little story about a Westerner, an old one. My father was not an educated man, but he was smart and perceptive. He came from early Mormon stock in Utah and spent all but 20 years of a long life in his beloved Beehive State. My father was a Westerner to the bone, back when that word might have meant something a little stronger than what it means today. The West he adored and perhaps sentimentalized was a place of informality. Handshakes in place of contracts, he sometimes said. And if it was a cliche, it was no less true. Unlocked doors, safe streets, neighbors with actual names. The house he grew up in tiny Orangeville, Utah, that's Emory County, had a little irrigation ditch running alongside the street out front. The street was dirt, and in Mormon village fashion, the backyards were gardens, not lawns, watered from the little ditches. And the farmers lived in town. So did their livestock. There were barns and sheds and hayricks all over the village. There were more cattle and horses than dogs and cats. My father grew up amid a dictum of cooperation. You didn't sue your neighbors when they took too long with their turn at the water. You went and talked to them. My father was not much of a man of words, but when he spoke directly. He had an unnerving way of looking you straight in the eyes. He got right to the point. My father's family did not own farmland, so a career in agriculture was not in his stars. When he finished high school and it was time to go to work, he took his first job in a coal mine in nearby Carbon County. At the age of 19, my father broke with Brigham Young's old taboo against Mormon men entering the mines. He took a job at Standardville, and there began his career. He spent the rest of his life in coal. And he carried that old dictum of cooperation with him underground. By the time I was born, my father had worked his way up to the best paying job in a mine. He was a face boss, meaning the head miner, where a crew attacked the coal seam. On the face of things, the obvious goal was production. But as my father would tell you, if you wanted to know, the real job was safety. How do you keep your men alive there at the coal face? It's the most dangerous place in the workaday world. How do you handle methane gas, rock falls and bursts, the ever-present coal dust, as explosive as methane, and dynamite all at once? How do you keep your crew in good cheer, working as a team, 3,000 feet underground with a mountain above your head, a mountain you are in the process of rapidly destabilizing from within? And what does any of this have to do with Charles Wilkinson? The answer is that word again, cooperation. Wallace Stegner thought about it and used the word well in what is perhaps his most quoted utterance. Bob Kiter quoted it. When the West, quote, finally learns that cooperation, not rugged individualism, is the pattern that most characterizes and preserves it, then it will have achieved itself and outlived its origins. Then it has a chance to create a society to match its scenery. John Leshy touched on it in some of his remarks yesterday. Charles can be a hard-headed litigator, and he is not known as being the kind of retiring academic who prefers to shy away from every fight, except for fights with faculty colleagues. Charles, in his 70s, manages to turn 31 overnight, and he's going to do something about those Bears ears over in Utah. But there's another side to him. As Professor Leshy told us yesterday, Charles wants us to make sure we listen to others, especially people we don't agree with. He's quite good at it. I know this about him because for 18 years, I was executive director of a small nonprofit based in Missoula. And for more than half that time, Charles was our board chair. Northern Lights Institute was an admittedly strange organization, an interesting blend of policy think tank, dispute resolution center, and publishing house. All of our work revolved around environmental issues in the rapidly changing West. Even our name was confusing. A nonprofit working on issues across the West, and yet the name was Northern Lights. It was not because the GPS had not yet been invented and we were confused about directions. The name grew from the group's original mission to explore a range of public policy issues in the northern Rocky states of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. The expanded focus came later. Northern Lights was among the first organizations in the West to explore and practice what later came to be known as collaborative conservation, sometimes called community-based conservation. That is to say, the use of so-called stakeholder roundtable groups to negotiate their way through issues, rather than relying on the courts, Congress, or legislative lobbying alone. We had a quarterly magazine called Northern Lights, and every edition carried a specific theme. One of our best editions, over the 17 years we published that journal, was titled The Art of Listening. That title pretty much summed up what we were about. One of our key staffers who worked with us for around 3 years was Daniel Kemmis, former Speaker of the House in the Montana State Legislature. We raised some money to enable Chemist to write his first book, Community and the Politics of Place. I regard that book, and Chemist's next two, as small classics among works about politics in the West, about politics, period. It sounds so far like all we were doing was publishing things, but that's not true. The largest portion of our budget went into a series of active conservation projects seeking to use the collaborative approach. We were working mostly in river and water issues all across the upper Missouri Basin and beyond, but our longest running project was on our home river, the Clark Fork, runs through Missoula. What we were trying to do was practice the ancient art of politics, as it had been described by Hannah Arendt. We were novices, amateurs, but that was the point. People living in a democracy are not supposed to be professional citizens, but it's a sad fact that our American democracy, to the extent that it still exists, is dominated by professional citizens, the brash and obnoxious talking heads who command the media 24/7. No wonder most of us want to duck underneath the battlefield of modern political discourse. Americans say they hate politics, but that can't be true because most of us have never actually experienced it. Politics has little to do with partisan bickering and gibberish, and even less to do with corporate-sponsored shouting matches between professional pundits. Politics is reasoned conversation, an ongoing demonstration that the art of the possible is still possible. I don't have time to draw out a portrait of those 18 years at Northern Lights, so I can only beg you to take my word for this. Those were magical years, the best of them, when Charles was our chair. Imagine working for a board of directors composed of these people: Charles F. Wilkinson, Terry Tempest Williams, Richard Trudell, the fine Crow Indian educator and leader Janice Windy Boy Peace, State Senator Mary Lou Reed of Idaho, former Secretary of Resources from California, Huey Johnson, Met Bennett, one of the founders of the Peace Corps, and the progressive and brilliant philanthropist Ann Roberts from New York. Charles and Dick both well remember our summer board retreats at the B-Bar Ranch in the Yellowstone Valley, way up at the top of the Tom Miner Basin. Great food. I always brought the caterer, a dear friend. Good wine and plenty. A few moose out in the meadows. And the finest conversation I will ever hear. The presiding mountain peak in those parts is called Electric Peak. I took to thinking it could have been named for our board and tiny staff working together every summer on a batch of dreams we shared. Electric, indeed. I want to go back to my father for a moment, a dirty man in a dirty industry. To be clear, my father's underground crews were not always harmonious, nor were they ever made up of only renegade Mormon boys. They were not all people like me and my Scandinavian relatives, a virtual fleet of Volvos in Utah. My father worked in the mines during a moment of rapid immigration into the U.S., and he worked on a daily basis with what he called a League of Nations: Greeks, Italians, Serbs, Mexicans, Finns, even a few Chinese. Not everyone spoke English. Not everyone felt welcome in lily white Utah. Dad would bring them home, ask them over to dinner. Mother, herself the daughter of immigrants, would cook for our visitors. We had a lot of them. And that brings me back to Charles. I want to talk about the confidence and the sense of intellectual generosity that Charles, maybe more than anyone, helped to instill in me. The core of this: as the board chair of Northern Lights, as my captain, Charles taught me that we cannot legitimately study or try to affect any natural resource policy in the West without thinking about and including indigenous interests, Native American people, and their sovereignty. If their sovereignty doesn't mean anything, then our sovereignty doesn't either. I was an aggressive activist who needed to hear that at the time. I heard it from Charles. And I finally realized that I'd been hearing it from my father and mother all along. I just needed now to bring the two worlds together. Charles is not old enough to be my father, but in a way he joined with my father, with both of my parents actually, in giving me a core principle, the principle of inclusiveness, which also happens to be the most important principle at the core of collaborative conservation. Charles taught me always to make the circle bigger. He wasn't born a Westerner, but he became one. And there's something really old-fashioned in his Westernness. There's a directness, a steadiness, a sense of calm integrity. You don't need to lock your doors around Charles. You just need to open your heart. I'm a teacher now, a professor. I have been for more than 20 years. I learned a long time ago what I think every teacher learns, whatever our training or specialization may be, to whatever degree we immerse ourselves in state-of-the-art information about teaching techniques, what we mostly do is go back to basics. We think about our greatest teachers and what made them great, and we try to emulate them. Charles doesn't know this, so I'll tell him. There is not a day in my classroom when I am not aware of his presence. I teach literature and creative writing now. I no longer teach seminars in natural resource policy or Western identity politics. Still, Charles and his work are on my mind. Charles always finds the poetry at the heart of the law because he never forgets the people. They are what the law is about. Thank you, friend.
Thank you, Don, and for reminding us that Charles inspires all of us to do what we try to do for the West more cooperatively and beautifully. So thank you. I think Britt is going to announce the lunch plans, but first a hand for our panel. Thank you all.
All right, everybody has worked very hard today, so you deserve a very good lunch, and we have one waiting for you upstairs on the second floor. It's in the Shaden Commons. As Kristen noted, we are a little bit behind time. Unfortunately, you noticed in the program we had hoped to have some remarks by Terry Tempest-Williams during lunch. She's not able to make it with us today. She's had a personal crisis come up. I know she's talked to Charles and passed on her deep regrets that she can't be here and her best wishes to Charles and to the whole group. But, so let's be really disciplined about this and try to come back about 1:35, and I think we can get right back on schedule. So thanks, everybody.